Have you ever witnessed a step that seemed imperfect yet profoundly altered everything? This is the tale of a young boy whose legs sometimes betray him, and a kind waitress who chose to follow him when no one else dared to move. There was no grand music, no dazzling spotlight, just a quiet moment, a small step, and a hushed room that waited to see what would unfold. What happened next transformed not only how others perceived him but also how his own father saw him. Before we delve into this poignant story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to connect with you. The soft notes of a jazz band filled the dining room of Heritage Oaks Restaurant, their warm melody weaving through the low lighting and white tablecloths. This was a place of unhurried elegance, where older couples lingered over coffee on Friday nights. It wasn't boisterous but alive with subtle movements, hands reaching across tables, gentle laughter, and the occasional couple swaying in the narrow aisles when a song stirred a forgotten memory. At table 8, tucked away by the window, sat 9-year-old Eli Granger. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a few rebellious strands escaped, and his pale blue button-down shirt was tucked into dress pants that made him appear older than his years. His legs, however, told a different story. They twitched beneath the table, not constantly, but just enough to signal their potential defiance. Diagnosed with a neurological condition at 2, Eli navigated muscle spasms and balance issues that made every step unpredictable. Consequently, each public movement came with a mental checklist. Who's watching? How far is the floor? Will I fall? Will they laugh? Across from him sat his father, Walter Granger, a man in his mid-40s with a clean-cut demeanor that suggested meticulous planning. His gray suit was impeccably pressed, his jaw squared, and his dark navy tie hadn't shifted since he fastened it that morning. Walter wasn't exactly cold, but his expression rarely changed. Even now, his eyes scanned the room as if analyzing data, not observing people. They didn't frequent public places. Walter preferred controlled environments. He knew the maitre d' by name here and had requested a corner booth to shield Eli from unwanted attention. But tonight, a call about a South Boston zoning issue had pulled Walter into the hallway for a moment. That moment was all it took. Eli's gaze had been fixed on her all evening, the waitress. Not in the way boys typically notice girls. It wasn't about her looks, though she was pretty, perhaps in her late 20s, with soft brown hair pulled into a bun and an understated grace in her movements. It was how she walked. She moved with a practiced fluidity, a smoothness that transcended mere plate carrying. There was something in the way her shoulders remained level, how she subtly shifted her weight. He noticed her shoes. Old dance flats, not standard server footwear, worn in places only dancers would recognize. When she returned to refill his lemonade, he didn't look up immediately. He focused on her shoes, soft-soled flats, worn in the precise spots that spoke of countless turns. Then, almost a whisper, he asked, "Did you used to dance?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, then knelt beside the table, evening their height. Her voice was gentle. "Yeah, I did." "Why'd you stop?" Eli asked, his tone devoid of accusation, just genuine curiosity. She glanced down at her hands, still holding the pitcher, then back up. "Tore a ligament. Right knee. Couldn't go back after that." "Oh." There was a pause. Then Eli, without looking at her, said, "Would you dance with me?" Just for a second. The room hadn't changed. The music played on, the gentle clatter of silverware and soft laughter continued. But something between them shifted. Ruby Lane, that was her name, slowly set the pitcher down. She looked at the boy, sensing his nervousness in the way he gripped the table's edge, how his knees pressed together as if bracing for impact. She didn't say yes right away. Instead she asked, "Are you sure?" Eli nodded once. That was all. Ruby stood, quickly scanning the room for urgent needs. None. She wiped her hands on her apron, turned to Eli and said, "Okay." Eli's chair scraped softly as he pushed himself up, moving slowly, cautiously, as if the floor might betray him. His right leg buckled slightly before he found his balance. Ruby didn't reach to steady him, she simply waited. When he stood fully, he looked up at her and raised one hand, his fingers small and hesitant. He didn't say anything else. She took his hand. They stepped forward together. It wasn't truly dancing. His movements were staggered and slow, his knees bending too much or not enough. But Ruby didn't guide him, she didn't correct him. She followed, carefully, gently, allowing him to dictate the pace, the direction, the rhythm. Around them, conversations faded. A couple at a nearby table froze mid-bite. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. He stumbled once, his foot catching on the smooth wood. A short laugh, not cruel but not kind either, came from a table across the room. He froze. Ruby leaned in slightly, enough for him to hear her whisper, "You're doing great. Keep going." He didn't respond, just nodded, tightened his grip a little and took another step. And in that moment, everything else vanished. Walter returned just as Eli took his third step. He'd only been gone a few minutes, maybe 4, enough to handle a zoning call and answer an email from his assistant. He stepped through the side hallway into the dining room and immediately stopped. His phone remained in his hand, but his eyes were locked on a scene he hadn't expected, didn't understand at first. He thought something had gone wrong. Eli was standing, not just standing but moving, and beside him holding his hand was the waitress. Walter didn't move. Eli's back was to him. Ruby faced slightly sideways, entirely focused on the boy. She wasn't leading, wasn't correcting his posture, wasn't rushing him. She was matching him step for step, tremble for tremble. Her face was calm but focused, as if she were attuned to a rhythm only Eli could hear. It wasn't dramatic. No spotlight, no applause. Just two people moving together in a space not even meant for dancing. Walter's first instinct was to step forward, to interrupt, to pull Eli back to the booth. The thought of people watching his son struggle in public triggered every protective reflex he'd cultivated for 9 years. His jaw tightened. He took a breath. Then he saw Eli stumble, not a major fall, but enough to slightly disrupt his balance. Ruby's hand shifted, not to steady him, but to allow the movement to play out without panic. She didn't pretend it didn't happen, she absorbed it. She let it be real. Someone laughed. It was a man near the bar, the kind of laugh that hides behind a napkin but still cuts through the air like a blade. Walter flinched, his hand tightening around his phone. His son heard it, of course he did. Eli stopped, shoulders tense, chin lowered. Walter could almost feel the shame radiating from him. The moment was about to break. Ruby leaned in, her voice soft but clear. "You're still doing fine." Eli didn't speak. He took a breath, then another step. Walter didn't move. Something stopped him, not fear, not confusion, but something else. Uncertainty. He had no idea what to do. For years he'd made every plan, mapped every route, anticipated every risk. And here was his son, moving, leading, and Walter was utterly unprepared. Eli took a fourth step, then a fifth. His movements weren't smoother, but they were steadier, more assured. He turned slightly, then shifted his weight the wrong way and had to pull back. Ruby followed him anyway. She didn't adjust the pace, didn't compensate. She stayed just behind him, trusting. Around the room people noticed. A woman in her 60s set down her wine glass, her eyes fixed on the pair. A younger man in his mid-30s paused, his fork hovering just above his plate. The jazz band, sensing something unfolding, slowed their playing. The piano softened to near silence, becoming more like background breath than music. Eli looked up at Ruby, his voice barely audible. "Is it okay?" She smiled, not broadly, not dramatically, just enough for him to feel it. "It's perfect." Walter's chest tightened. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the word perfect. He'd never used that word with Eli, not once. He'd always spoken in measured terms. Be careful. Don't rush. Wait for me. But here was a woman who had known his son for less than an hour saying something he had never dared to say. A few more steps, then Eli stopped. His body was tense, breathing shallow. Ruby didn't release his hand. She didn't suggest they sit down. She waited. Then she said, "You can stop when you want, but you don't have to yet." Eli stayed where he was. Walter took a small step forward, then stopped again. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. He wasn't the one being watched, but he was the one who had to decide whether or not to interrupt what was happening. Ruby spoke again, not to him but to Eli. "You've got room." And somehow she wasn't just talking about the physical space. Eli moved one last time, this time with more control. Not because his legs suddenly grew stronger, but because something inside him had changed. He had been seen, not pitted, not helped. Seen. And Ruby had said yes. Not out loud, not dramatically, but every step she took proclaimed it. "I trust you. I'll follow you. You lead." Walter finally breathed. His chest loosened, his hand lowered. The phone screen faded to black, irrelevant now. The moment was his son's. Eli released Ruby's hand. She nodded once. They didn't bow, they didn't wave. They simply turned back toward their table. Eli sat down slowly, eyes wide, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. His breathing slowed. Ruby straightened her apron, picked up the pitcher of lemonade from the sideboard, and walked away without another word. Walter walked back to the table, his chair scraping softly against the floor as he sat. For a few seconds he didn't speak. Eli looked up at him, no smile, no grin, just a quiet expression that waited for something. Walter's mouth opened, then closed again. He finally said, "You stood." Eli nodded. Walter looked down at the table. "You didn't wait for me." Another nod. Then Eli added, "I didn't think I needed to." It wasn't defiance, just a fact. A quiet fact that sat between them like an untouched plate. The music started again, slowly, carefully, but nothing else was quite the same. Not for Walter. Not anymore. The ride home was quiet, not awkward, not tense or irritated, just still, as if both of them had things to say, but neither wanted to be the first to speak. Outside the car windows, the lights of downtown Boston gave way to the softer glow of residential streets, tree-lined avenues and familiar turns. Walter kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his mind wasn't there. He was still at the restaurant, still watching Eli's feet, still hearing that question in his head. "Is it okay?" And Ruby's answer, "It's perfect." Eli sat in the passenger seat, back straight, hands in his lap. His body was still. Usually he fidgeted on car rides, especially after dinner, sometimes humming under his breath or tapping his fingers to a rhythm only he could hear. Not tonight. He stared out the window, watching the world blur by in streaks of orange and white, his face unreadable. Walter cleared his throat once, a shallow, instinctive attempt to speak. Nothing came out. His tongue touched the roof of his mouth, then dropped. He inhaled quietly, then let it go. Still nothing. There was too much to say and no idea how to begin. The last few minutes at the restaurant had dislodged something within him. For years he had lived with the idea that protecting Eli meant controlling every variable. Where they sat, how far they walked, who might be watching, what might go wrong. And tonight, in the time it took him to answer a phone call, Eli had made a decision without him. He'd stood. He'd moved. And more than that, he'd led. They turned onto Willow Street. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing faintly, a few dogs barking distantly in the dark. As they pulled into the driveway, Walter slowed to a stop but didn't turn off the engine. He let the car idle, headlights stretching across the front lawn. The porch light was on as always. The lamp inside the living room was on a timer, casting its soft amber glow through the blinds. Still neither of them moved. Eli finally spoke. "I don't think I need you to hold my hand so much anymore." Walter's heart skipped. It wasn't the words, it was the way Eli said them. Not defiant, not distant, just steady, quiet, as if he'd been thinking about it for a while and had finally decided to say it aloud. Walter turned his head slightly, looked at Eli. The boy wasn't looking at him. He was still facing the window. His voice was calm. It wasn't a child's plea. It was something else, something harder to face. "What do you mean?" Walter asked, though he already knew. "I mean, I can still fall. I know that. But I think I can lead too. If someone lets me." There was no bitterness in his tone, just truth, and that truth landed between them with the weight of a decade. Walter stared forward again, his hands tightening slightly around the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his grip. For a second he felt his throat close up, not from emotion but from resistance. His instinct wanted to argue, wanted to explain how it wasn't that simple, how people didn't always understand, how the world could be cruel, how Eli needed to be careful. But he didn't say any of that because deep down he knew this wasn't about safety. It was about trust. "I've always held your hand," Walter said, his voice lower now, more measured, "because I wanted to keep you safe." "I know," Eli replied. "But sometimes when you hold too tight it makes it harder to move." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was honest. Walter felt it settle in the space between them, not as an accusation, but as a quiet request. "Let me try. Let me fall if I have to. Let me be the one who decides when to reach out." Walter thought of every time Eli had tripped over a curb, every time a kid at school stared too long, every time a stranger whispered after watching him walk. He remembered the therapy sessions, the medical forms, the routines built around muscle stretches and balance work. He remembered lifting Eli into the car when his legs gave out. He remembered holding him when the frustration turned to tears. And through it all he'd built a wall of protection. But now that same wall was standing between his son and something more important than safety. Independence. Eli unbuckled his seat belt. The soft click broke Walter's train of thought. The boy reached for the door handle but didn't open it yet. "I'm not saying I don't need you," Eli said, still not looking at him. I don't always want to be the one being led." Walter looked at him, truly looked. The narrow shoulders, the thinning frame, the quiet eyes that were no longer full of hesitation but filled with something steadier. Not confidence, not yet, but something close. And Walter realized he had never prepared himself for this part. He had prepared for Eli's falls, never for his steps. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no counterargument, no correction to make, no wisdom to offer. Eli wasn't asking for permission, he was telling his truth. And Walter, for the first time, didn't feel the need to respond. He gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but Eli saw it. And that was enough. Eli opened the car door, stepped out slowly, one foot steady on the pavement, then the other. He closed the door gently behind him, not slamming it, not rushing, just calm, sure. He walked up the path toward the front door, his steps uneven but determined. Walter sat alone in the car, the engine still humming quietly. He looked down at the steering wheel, his hands resting in his lap now. Something in him felt different, not broken, not healed, just aware. Tonight Eli had taken a step and Walter hadn't stopped him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them could define yet. He turned off the engine, the headlights cutting out. The night pressed in, still and cool. Walter exhaled slowly, opened the door and stepped out. This time he didn't walk ahead. He followed. The next morning, Walter arrived at Heritage Oaks before opening hours. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few staff vehicles near the back. The sky was overcast, the light thin and gray, casting soft shadows across the pavement. He sat in his car for a minute before getting out, unsure of what he was even going to say. He wasn't dressed as he had been the night before. No suit, no tie, just jeans, a pullover, and that unfamiliar sense of having no script to follow. The dining room was quiet when he walked in. No music, no clinking silverware, just the hum of refrigeration from the kitchen and the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air. He spotted her near the bar, Ruby Lane. She was polishing glasses with a white cloth, moving with a rhythm so calm it looked almost like part of a routine. When she heard the door open, she looked up. There was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but something between acknowledgement and restraint. "Mr. Granger," she said evenly. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Just neutral, as if offering him the choice of defining the conversation. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet from the bar, his hands at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. "You weren't afraid," he said. Ruby didn't respond right away. She placed the glass down carefully, then folded the cloth in half. Afraid of what? Walter shifted his weight from one foot to the other. That he'd fall. That someone would laugh. That it would go wrong. Her eyes stayed on his, calm, measured. "You mean, was I afraid of failure?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her, feeling how small the word sounded when she said it aloud. "No," Ruby said. "I wasn't afraid he'd fall." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the edge of the bar. "I was afraid no one would follow him." That hit harder than Walter expected. He stared at a spot on the countertop, lips pressed tight. Ruby didn't rush him, she just waited. She continued, softer now. "Kids like Eli, they're used to being guided, held back, told how to move, when to stop, what's too far. Even the people who love them the most, especially them, build rules around every step they take. It's not cruelty, it's fear. But fear teaches them they need permission for everything. So when one of them decides to move first, to lead, and no one follows, that's what breaks them. Not the falling. The silence." Walter's throat tightened. He remembered Eli's hand raised in the middle of that restaurant, that quiet request not for help but for trust. He remembered standing there, frozen, unable to act, unable to step in or step away. "I thought he needed me," Walter said, his voice low, "to hold him up, to keep him from getting hurt." Ruby nodded once. "He does need you. But not the way you think." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Because he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at you." Ruby didn't smile. She didn't gloat. He just absorbed the statement. Because I said yes, she replied. The silence after that wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Walter stepped closer to the bar, both hands resting on the edge now. He looked around the quiet room, the same floor where Eli had walked, the same space that had changed something in both of them. He cleared his throat. He didn't ask me. He didn't wait for my permission. No, Ruby said. He offered leadership and he waited to see who would follow. Walter let out a slow breath. The weight of it felt like years of control unraveling at once. He finally said, I've been protecting him from the wrong things. Ruby raised an eyebrow. From what? From the world, Walter said. From disappointment, from embarrassment, from people who don't understand. And did it work? She asked. No, he said almost before she finished the question. It just taught him to be afraid of moving without me. Ruby stepped out from behind the bar and walked toward the center of the room. She gestured gently toward the polished hardwood floor, now catching soft streaks of light through the windows. You want to protect him? She asked. He nodded. Then don't just teach him how not to fall, she said. Teach yourself how to let go. Walter looked down at the floor, then back at her, his voice dropping, almost hesitant. I don't need someone to teach my son how to dance. He's already doing that. Ruby waited. He took a breath. I need someone to teach me how not to hold him back. She held his gaze, no lecture, no smile, just understanding. Then she extended her hand, her grip steady. Then start by stepping where he steps, not where you think he should go. She gestured toward the floor. You see all of them? Walter looked out across the space, remembering the moment, remembering the room holding its breath. They weren't following the music, she said. They were following each other. Walter's voice caught slightly. I thought I had to keep him upright. I thought that was my job as a father. Maybe it was, Ruby said. But maybe now it's time for something else. He turned to her, eyes quiet. Like what? She tilted her head, voice low. Maybe it's about not pulling him off balance when he finds his own. Walter nodded, his shoulders relaxed. The pressure in his chest didn't vanish, but it moved, shifted, softened. He asked, Where do I start? Ruby pointed to the center of the floor. Right there. One step behind him. Then quieter, and this time don't lead. Just follow. Walter stared at the spot for a moment, then stepped forward. The Spring Community Festival was held at a modest auditorium on the edge of Milton, a space usually reserved for PTA meetings, local theater rehearsals, and senior bingo nights. But today, folding chairs lined every inch of the room, hand-painted signs hung from the walls, and construction paper lanterns, mostly crooked but full of heart, dangled overhead. The program had no headliners, no professional performers. It was a celebration of kids who didn't usually get stage time. Children who moved differently, spoke softly, or sometimes didn't speak at all. Backstage, the air was thick with nervous energy. Costumes rustled, stagehands whispered instructions, and the echo of an earlier group's tambourines still lingered in the curtains. Eli stood off to the side, dressed in a plain white shirt, black pants, and dress shoes his father had polished that morning. His hair was carefully combed, his collar sat neat. There were no sequins, no props, no grand routine. He held nothing in his hands but himself. Walter sat in the third row between two parents he didn't know. Ruby stood near the side of the room with a clipboard in one hand and a water bottle in the other. She wasn't in charge of the event, not officially, but no one questioned her presence. Everyone knew she was the reason this moment even existed. Eli was last on the schedule. Not because he was the best, not because he had the most practiced act. Ruby had simply asked the organizers if he could go last, not to end the show with a flourish, but to open something quiet, something different. The announcer stepped up to the microphone, her voice warm and practiced. Our final participant today, she said, smiling at the audience, doesn't have a song. He doesn't have a routine. He just has a direction. And sometimes that's enough. There was no applause, just silence as Eli stepped out onto the small stage. The wooden planks creaked under his shoes. His eyes didn't scan the crowd, he didn't look for approval. He just walked to the center, turned to face forward, and stood still. He didn't start right away. He took a breath, his shoulders lifting gently, then falling. His knees were slightly bent, arms relaxed by his sides. His face was calm, focused, not tense, not scared, just present. Then he moved. Left foot forward, a small shift. Right foot, a pause. The movement wasn't smooth, it wasn't even steady. But it was deliberate, measured. His body adjusted with each step. The audience didn't know whether to clap or sit still, so they sat watching, listening, not to music but to the quiet rhythm of his movement. From the third row, a woman in her 40s stood up. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a floral print dress. She didn't say anything. She just stepped into the aisle and took a step forward, mimicking Eli's pace. No fanfare, no attention drawn, just movement. A man in a wheelchair rolled slightly forward, pausing beside her. Then another parent. A teenage girl near the back stood and followed slowly. A dozen others joined, not approaching Eli, not crowding him but stepping with him. Across the room people began to rise, awkward steps, small gestures, each one a quiet statement. We see you. We're with you. Eli didn't look up. He kept moving, his hands raised slightly, elbows bent, palms open. Not for applause, not to perform, just to hold space. His body shifted into a slow turn, one foot pivoting slightly too far, causing him to catch himself. He did not fall. Ruby stood near the stage entrance, arms crossed, but her eyes glistened. Walter leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. His voice was quiet. What is he doing? He asked. Ruby didn't look at him. He's not dancing, she said. He's leading. Walter looked back at his son. No music played, no beat set the pace, but the room moved. Not in unison, not perfectly, but together. Teachers, parents, grandparents, all stepping, some swaying gently, some stumbling a little. And still they moved. Eli reached the edge of the stage and stopped. His breath was heavy but steady. His chest rose and fell. His eyes didn't search for approval. He stood with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. In the back of the room, a little girl with leg braces stood slowly. She looked at her father, who gave her a small nod. She stepped once, then again, following the boy on stage like he was showing her something new, something possible. Walter felt a pressure build in his chest that wasn't sadness, wasn't pride, not exactly. It was something deeper, a shift. He had spent years trying to protect Eli from the world, but today the world was following him. There was no applause when Eli turned to leave the stage. The silence wasn't rejection. It was reverence. The kind of quiet that only happens when a room understands it has witnessed something that cannot be replicated. He stepped off stage without looking for his father, without looking for Ruby. He didn't need to. The room had already followed. And Walter stood, not to lead him, not to catch him, just to walk behind, ready finally to go wherever his son decided to go next. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.